In the late 19th century, southern Africa was not supposed to matter. On European maps, it appeared as a distant appendage of the world, a land of scattered farms, indigenous kingdoms, and long stretches of dry earth that produced little of value. Britain already ruled India. It controlled trade routes across Asia. Compared to that, the Cape seemed irrelevant. That illusion would not survive the discovery of gold. In 1867, diamonds were found near Kimberley. Overnight, prospectors poured in from Europe, America, and Australia. What had been dismissed as empty land suddenly shimmered with promise. The British Empire took notice, but not in the way people expect. There was no immediate invasion. No grand declaration, no rush of redcoats. Instead, Britain sent bankers. By the 1880s, another discovery changed everything. Deep beneath the Witwatersrand Ridge, geologists uncovered the largest gold deposits ever found on Earth. Not veins, entire reefs, miles of gold-bearing rock, gold on a scale that could reshape global finance. And Britain understood something crucial before anyone else did. Gold was not just wealth, it was control. At the time, the global financial system ran on the gold standard. Currencies were trusted because they could be exchanged for gold. Whoever controlled gold controlled money. Whoever controlled money controlled trade, credit, and power. South Africa was no longer a colony on the edge of empire. It was a vault, but Britain faced a problem. The goldfields did not lie neatly inside British territory. They were located in the Boer republics, independent states founded by Dutch settlers who distrusted British rule and fiercely defended their autonomy. Marching an army in would be costly, politically dangerous, and unnecessary. Because Britain had learned a better way, instead of conquering South Africa, it would financialize it. British capital flooded in. London banks financed mining companies. British investors bought shares. British engineers designed the extraction systems. British shipping firms handled exports. Insurance houses in London underwrote every operation. The gold did not need to be British-owned on paper. It only needed to move through British hands. Mining magnates like Cecil Rhodes emerged, men who did not wear uniforms, but wielded more power than generals. Rhodes spoke openly about empire, but his real weapon was finance. His companies dictated wages, controlled labor, and shaped policy through investment. Gold left South Africa. Profits flowed to London. Decisions were made thousands of miles away, and the most important part, the local governments became dependent. Infrastructure followed the money. Railways were built not to connect African communities, but to move ore to ports. Towns rose around mines. Entire economies bent toward extraction. Taxes were structured around mining revenue. South Africa was becoming rich, but it was not becoming free. As British influence deepened, the Boer governments resisted. They tried to assert control over mining rights. They raised taxes. They questioned labor practices. Each move triggered panic in London's markets, and panic was leverage. Capital withdrew, credit tightened, pressure mounted. Britain did not threaten war, it threatened instability. And in a world addicted to gold, instability was unforgivable. By the end of the century, South Africa stood at a crossroads. It appeared independent, its flags still flew, its governments still met, but its economy no longer belonged to it. Gold had done what armies could not, it had opened the door. Britain did not seize South Africa with cannons, it seized it with balance sheets. As gold production expanded, so did British oversight. Financial advisors appeared. Banking regulations were harmonized with London. Currency policies quietly aligned with imperial interests. Insurance firms dictated safety standards. Shipping companies set prices. None of it looked like occupation. That was the point. British newspapers spoke of progress, modernization. Development, the mines created jobs, the railways boosted trade, capital was flowing, but beneath the optimism something darker was forming. Gold extraction required labor, cheap labor, controlled labor. To keep profits high, mining companies pressured local governments to regulate African workers aggressively. Pass laws were expanded, movement was restricted, wages were suppressed. Entire communities were reshaped to serve the mines. This was not racial ideology first, it was financial necessity. British investors demanded returns, gold prices fluctuated, costs had to be controlled somewhere. Labor became the variable that could be squeezed, and London approved. As tensions rose between the British-backed mining interests and the Boer governments, Britain positioned itself carefully. It framed every dispute as a threat to stability, to markets, to global confidence. The Boer republics were painted as reckless. backward, dangerous to investment, and once again Britain waited. The moment came in 1895 with the disastrous Jameson Raid, an unauthorized British-backed incursion meant to destabilize the Transvaal government. It failed spectacularly. The raiders were captured. Britain publicly disavowed the attempt, but the message had been sent. Gold mattered more than sovereignty. From that point forward, war became inevitable. Not because Britain wanted land, but because it wanted certainty. Markets despise uncertainty. Independent governments that interfere with profit are uncertain. In 1899, the Anglo-Boer War began. It was brutal. Concentration camps, scorched earth, civilians suffering on a massive scale. Britain deployed its army at last, not to discover gold, not to claim territory, but to secure an economic system that already existed. When the war ended in 1902, the Boer republics were crushed. South Africa was unified under British control. But here is the crucial detail most histories rush past. The mines never changed hands. British corporations already owned them. The war did not create British dominance, it formalized it. Afterward, South Africa's political structures were reorganized to protect mining interests. Labor systems hardened. Racial segregation intensified. Financial ties to London deepened. Gold production soared. Britain had achieved something extraordinary. It ruled South Africa without needing to micromanage it. It extracted wealth without constant military presence. It shaped society without appearing to govern daily life. Gold had paid for everything, and the system it built would outlive the empire itself. Because when Britain eventually left, the economic architecture remained. The mines stayed, the labor system stayed, the inequalities stayed. South Africa would fight for freedom in the decades ahead. But it would do so inside an economy that had been designed, very deliberately, to serve someone else. When the guns finally fell silent in 1902, Britain declared victory. The Boer republics were defeated, their armies broken, their capitals occupied. On paper, South Africa was now firmly inside the British imperial system. But something unusual happened next. Britain did not celebrate land, it consolidated infrastructure. The mines resumed operation almost immediately. Railways were repaired first, ports were expanded. Financial offices reopened before schools or hospitals. London's priority was clear: gold flow must not stop. The war had not been fought to seize resources. It had been fought to protect a system already in place. British officials framed reconstruction as generosity. They spoke of rebuilding, reconciliation, and progress. But every major decision was filtered through one question: will this reassure investors? To that end, South Africa's post-war administration was redesigned around mining profitability. Tax structures favored extraction companies. Labor regulations were standardized to guarantee a steady, disciplined workforce. African mobility was restricted further, not as a matter of ideology, but as a matter of cost control. The cheaper and more controllable the labor, the more stable the gold output. Stability meant confidence. Confidence meant capital. Capital meant London remained in charge. What emerged was something far more durable than colonial rule. It was an economic architecture. South Africa was unified politically in 1910, forming the Union of South Africa. It was presented as self-governing. White leaders sat in parliament. Local elections were held. Flags changed, but the core of power did not move. Mining corporations, overwhelmingly British-owned, dominated the economy. Their executives spoke directly with London banks. Their interests shaped legislation quietly, persistently. Governments rotated. Policies shifted at the margins. Gold remained untouched. British influence no longer needed to be enforced with troops. It had been normalized through dependency. South Africa's currency, trade patterns, and export markets were all tethered to Britain. Any deviation risked financial shock, and shocks were devastating. When gold prices dipped, unemployment surged. When London tightened credit, budgets collapsed. Each crisis reinforced the same lesson for South African leaders. Independence had limits, very clear limits. This was when race hardened into policy. Segregation had existed before British domination, but now it was systematized. Racial hierarchy became a tool for economic efficiency. By dividing the population, mining companies ensured a compliant labor base and reduced the risk of unified resistance. British officials did not invent apartheid, but they built the financial logic that made it profitable. Past laws, labor compounds, and land restrictions were framed as administrative necessities. The language was sterile, technical, rational. It hid the truth. A society was being engineered to serve capital. By the time Britain's global power began to wane after World War I, South Africa's economy was already locked into place. Gold exports underwrote the British pound during financial crises. South African resources helped stabilize Britain's own economy during turbulent decades. In this relationship, one side absorbed risk, the other absorbed reward, and then came the moment Britain feared: decolonization. After World War II, empires collapsed everywhere. India gained independence. Colonies across Africa followed. Britain's flags came down one by one. South Africa was different. Britain did not rush to leave, and when it eventually stepped back, it did so carefully, because the system no longer required oversight. Local elites had learned to protect it themselves. When apartheid formally began in 1948, Britain expressed concern. It issued statements. It frowned diplomatically, but British capital stayed. Gold production continued. Trade continued. Profits continued. Condemnation was symbolic. The money was real. Britain had achieved something extraordinary. It had created a structure so deeply embedded that it survived war, regime change, and moral outrage. South Africa could change governments, policies, even flags, but as long as the mines operated and exports flowed, the system held. The empire was fading. The mechanism was not. And that mechanism would shape South Africa's future long after Britain stopped calling it a colony. When South Africa held its first democratic elections in 1994, the world watched in awe. After decades of apartheid, Nelson Mandela stood before cheering crowds and promised a new future. One nation, one vote. One destiny. The flags changed, the laws changed, the prisons opened, and for a moment it felt like history had been corrected, but history does not release its grip so easily. Behind the celebrations, behind the speeches and reconciliation commissions, South Africa inherited something far heavier than apartheid's moral wreckage. It inherited an economy designed not to uplift its people, but to extract value efficiently. The mines did not close, the ownership did not radically shift, the capital did not return home, gold still flowed outward. By the mid-1990s, British and international corporations had already adapted, some rebranded. Some relocated headquarters, some merged into global conglomerates. The names changed, but the structure endured. South Africa was now politically free, but economically it remained locked. Mining profits continued to leave the country. Financial decisions were still shaped by international markets. Credit ratings mattered more than popular demands. Any policy that threatened investor confidence triggered warnings, downgrades, capital flight. The same pressure Britain had perfected a century earlier still worked, without Britain needing to apply it directly. This is the part rarely discussed. Apartheid did not end the system. It protected it until it was strong enough to survive on its own. When the new government considered nationalizing mines, markets reacted instantly. Currency wobbled, investment stalled, advisors warned of disaster. International institutions recommended caution. The message was clear: change too much and you will be punished. South Africa chose stability, and stability meant compromise. Today, South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries on earth. Wealth is concentrated, poverty is widespread, unemployment is chronic. The scars of apartheid are still visible, but they are now reinforced by economics, not law. Gold still comes out of the ground, but most South Africans never see its benefits. This was not an accident. It was the end result of a system built patiently, deliberately, and legally over more than a century, a system Britain helped design at every critical stage. Britain does not need to issue orders. It does not need to intervene. It does not even need to be present. The rules are already written. This is the true legacy of empire in the modern world. Not flags, not governors, not armies, but structures that outlive the people who built them. When Britain controlled South Africa directly, it ruled openly. When it lost that control, it lost responsibility, but not influence. Because influence had already been converted into markets, contracts, and expectations, and those are harder to overthrow than soldiers. South Africa's story is not unique. It is simply one of the clearest. A country rich in resources, poor in outcomes, independent in name, constrained in reality. The gold that once stabilized the British pound now stabilizes global markets. The labor system that once fed imperial profits now feeds multinational balance sheets. And the question this history leaves behind is not about Britain alone. It is about power. because the most effective form of control is not the one enforced with violence. It is the one that convinces you there is no alternative. South Africa fought bravely for political freedom, but the war over its wealth was decided long before the first ballot was cast, and that is the quiet truth empires prefer to leave buried. Colonies across Africa followed. Britain's flags came down one by one. South Africa was different. Britain did not rush to leave, and when it eventually stepped back, it did so carefully, because the system no longer required oversight. Local elites had learned to protect it themselves. When apartheid formally began in 1948, Britain expressed concern. It issued statements. It frowned diplomatically, but British capital stayed. Gold production continued. Trade continued. Profits continued. Condemnation was symbolic. The money was real. Britain had achieved something extraordinary. It had created a structure so deeply embedded that it survived war, regime change, and moral outrage. South Africa could change governments, policies, even flags, but as long as the mines operated and exports flowed, the system held. The empire was fading. The mechanism was not. And that mechanism would shape South Africa's future long after Britain stopped calling it a colony.